Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this webinar on behalf of VLA Virtual Legal Advisory. As you all may or may not know, 10th October is World Mental Health Day. And for that, we are having this webinar and focusing on this year's Mental Health Day theme, which is mental health as a universal right. With me, I've got two of my favorite guest speakers who have appeared on a number of the VLA webinars, and I'm just so thankful to these lovely ladies for being here with us today. Shanta Maharaj from South Africa. Shanta, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Sure. Absolute pleasure, Sana. Thank you.
And for those who may not know, for those who might not remember, Shanta is a counselor and a neuroagility practitioner. Shanta, you may have to explain that, when you are talking about yourself, because I know that it's probably a little complex for people like me to understand. And then we have Julia Chin, the amazing Julia Chin, who happens to be an anti-money laundering expert, and she has held some high positions at banks, where she has headed the AML departments. So, Julia, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right. So, basically, when we talk about mental health, I'm just going to keep this webinar quite informal. And the purpose is that every year we have these different days, these different events, and this gives us an opportunity to talk about things that are very important. And it gives other people as well an opportunity to know that they are not suffering alone. Now, this year's theme is that mental health is a universal right. So I'm just going to say a few things, Shanta and Julia, before I start with the questions. And I'm going to say that mental health has been recognized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And of course, if there is an issue with your mental health, that can also lead to a human rights violation, if of course it hasn't been dealt with properly, or if it has occurred as a result of a human rights abuse. The United Nations has come up with this program, this agenda for 2030, and they've come up with a list of these what's called SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and almost all of them, whether intentionally or unintentionally, do focus on mental health. So good health and well-being, of course, directly focuses on mental well-being, but then you have other SDGs as well, like no poverty, zero hunger, gender equality, reduced inequalities, the right to decent work, peace, justice, strong institutions, and the targets of all of these different goals has mental health, at its very core. But despite all of this talk, and this is probably why we are having this webinar, is that despite all of this talk, one wonders, whether all of this is pure rhetoric and how much of this is actually being implemented practically. So according to the WHO, 1 in 8 people globally have mental health conditions, and there is a soaring rate amongst adolescents and young people. As well, depression, of course, is emerging as a huge problem. And some of the main reasons, for all of this is a lack of adequate funding and resources, a lack of community-based mental health support, a lack of participation and empowerment, especially in terms of decision-making when it comes to those who are suffering from mental health conditions, and not to forget stigma, which is one of the major problems. And then obviously from a legal perspective, the problem with legal protections. So this is the overall picture. Now, Shanta, I would like to ask you, in terms of all of this, the fact that we celebrate this day so enthusiastically, we talk about these issues, and we have been doing so for many years. So what is the problem?
I think something that I'm seeing every day is this business of brushing things under the carpet. And I'm going to be very direct here. Countries and governments do not want to expose the problems with their people. And they hide behind it, saying, oh, all is very well here, right? In our country, everything is perfect. We have happiness days, we have this, that, and the other. That is absolute, and I'm going to use a beautiful English word, balderdash. Because those things do not exist. Those happiness days are there to brainwash people. There's also another issue with culture. And I'm talking about country culture, and I'm talking about our culture that we assume comes with our ethnicity, right? We don't want to tell people because it's going to mean that we are weak. And sadly, the economic situation, you did mention finance, the economic situation in many countries, and I say this with respect to all governments, is that they have a lot of people who have come in for jobs. Those people have left their families. They've left their stability in order to indirectly create stability for their families back home. Very often, those people are victims of mental health abuse. But because they have a purpose, because they need the money, they endure it. And those countries appear as the magnets for immigrants. And that's where a lot of the problems come from across the world. So I think that that's where the problem is. It's with government.
Absolutely, Shanta. I mean, that's where it starts from. And I think that when you start talking about the government and the focus that any government has, and we're not talking about a specific country, it's usually the political conflicts that they have with different political parties. They have their own agenda. And some of these things, that are basic fundamental rights or human rights, these are horribly neglected. So you rightly, highlight this. And Julia, I would actually like to ask you, what is your take on what Shanta says in terms of, your own country, perhaps, and especially in terms of workplace culture? I mean, you've been a part of many financial industries, and it's quite important to understand, what sort of policies do industries or organizations have when they're dealing with people suffering from mental health. Over to you.
Yeah, I think in terms of corporates, a lot of them have already started looking at mental health as part of diversity and inclusion. I don't know whether this is the right place to put it. The thing is, while this is being acknowledged, I think there's still a lot of work to be done here. Say, for example, people who suffer from depression, mental health, it's very hard for them to get insurance. So, and it is still a taboo. It's a stigma in a lot of the cultures as well. So someone who, just because he or she has depression, it's very difficult to get hospitalization insurance. So which is totally ridiculous to me. So as Shanta mentioned about the stigma, there's also the part about the financial. Imagine someone who is actually been diagnosed clinically to have depression, to not be able to get insurance. Do you think anyone would want to come forward to see a doctor and admit that they have a problem? And we all know that with mental health, acknowledging that you have a problem and you need help is 50% to recovery. It's only those people who are denying it, that are not seeking help, they end up the ones who suffer the most, and so do their loved ones. So I think I would also like to touch on this part about mental health, is that how it relates to financial crime as well, is where when someone has mental health problem, he or she is more vulnerable to being a victim of scam. And on the flip side, for someone who has actually had been a victim of fraud and scam, they tend to have mental health issues. So this mental health is definitely a very critical point.
Thanks, Julia. So many important and valid points over there. Yeah, firstly, apart from the fact that Mental Health Day is approaching, this is Cyber Security Awareness Month. So, Julia, thanks for bringing that up. It's very important, and we will discuss that in more detail. Just going on a little bit about what you mentioned about the diversity and inclusion policies of organizations. I've noticed that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we are focusing more on things like cross-cultural exchanges and things like women empowerment. We're focusing more on those things, and as Shanta rightly said, when it comes to mental health, it's sort of you know um, well, yeah, putting it on one side. Now, with this, I also wanted to actually say that when we talk about mental health, people tend to immediately think that someone has a diagnosed mental disorder, and that's not necessarily what mental health is. I mean, I have my own mental health, mental well-being, which may have nothing to do with a diagnosed disorder, but anything, and pressures from a workplace, family pressures, or whatever societal pressures can have an impact on that. And I think that it becomes very hard for the lay person to actually differentiate between between those. So Shanta, coming back to you now, when we talk about things like especially, let's focus on organizations, talking about mental health over there, and a diagnosed mental health problem. Do people, are people qualified enough to actually understand these terms within organizations?
I'm going to share something with you. So I do emotional intelligence profiling as well. Neuroagility profiling is a whole new thing, and I studied under Dr. Vermeulen for that. He owns the Neuralink training in South Africa, and of course he does it internationally. Now, I find that when I have to do an emotional intelligence assessment with management, they think I'm going to come in and just meet one person. That's not how it works. I work with 5 other people whose emails they provide to me. And when I go back with that, the result to discuss that 30-page report with them, I'm not met very well. I don't receive cordiality, because emotional intelligence can never be measured by the person himself. It's how that person interacts with others. So are our corporates adequately qualified? No. My other problem is non-registered lay counseling, right? Because very often, and I see both Julia and you smiling, that has a very, very strong bias to it, right? And very often it's based on religion and culture. And that becomes an issue, because when we counsel, we need to be objective. So are these people who are supposed to be our work providers, etc., adequately trained? Do they understand the terminology? Unfortunately, few and far between. They don't. And they look at you as a threat. And again, I reiterate, having a lay counselor is one of the most dangerous things ever. I see heads nodding, so I think you agree with me. So yeah, that's what I feel about it. And Julia, thanks for bringing up that management thing, etc., because I was waiting to bring up emotional intelligence and you just led me into this. Thank you.
No, thank you for that, Shanta. It's again a couple of points over there that and this is to do with the stigma element of things that in Pakistan. So, for example, things are now slowly and gradually changing, that when you talk about mental health in general, and you talk about going to a counselor, for example, people are not so biased. But of course, we have, terms like pagal, which Julia may not understand, but it means, those sort of terms are unfortunately still used. They might not be used openly, but there has become a little bit of acceptance. But having said that, Shanta, I agree with you that within organizations, you still have that draconian culture where things are hushed up. And this goes back to what you said initially about the those happiness days. The happiness days are actually celebrated more in order to divert the attention from things like workplace
Of
harassment,
course.
bullying, and all of these mental health problems that come from workplace harassment and things like that.
Yeah.
And yes, and that is still a problem with all this rhetoric. This is one question that I often ask, that we talk, and when I say we, it's not just us advocates. I think we are more honest with what we say. But when we talk about the hierarchies within organizations or other sorts of structures, are you just saying empty, hollow words, or do you really mean it? So coming back to you, Julia, you touched on the something very important about cybersecurity. And while we talk about things like harassment, I mean, cyber harassment and scams, as you rightly said, has become such a problem. And we often see that victims of cyber bullying, cyber harassment keep bottling these issues. They're not able to speak to people about it. And sometimes this even results in suicides, unfortunately. So what is your take on that?
I think it has become even worse post-COVID, where there's less of a social interaction, physical interaction between individuals, and people have gone more into all these online friendships, right? And then social media has become a really huge part of our lives. You and I connected through LinkedIn, so did I connect with Shanta through LinkedIn. So this is already one platform, and we see a lot of people post only the positive things on the social media, and then there's a lot of there's a risk of people comparing themselves. Hey, I'm already past 50 and I'm a failure because I'm not like any of these people who are posting all their successes on LinkedIn, right? So this is one area which is not even cyberbullying yet, but already as individuals we may feel inadequate, and then if you top that on with cyberbullying, it's going to be worse. And then with that comes the danger of social engineering. And I think this is particularly critical to also highlight that. I think arising from the COVID, I think we probably saw a lot more people being isolated, and there are a lot of people who lost their jobs as well. Right, so this is already one area where they became vulnerable, they are distressed, and this is how the bad guys actually are making use of this vulnerability. They advertise, they make friends with you, job scams, or they target the lonely individuals, romantic scams. And then you have all this pig butchering, as they call it, going around. They make friends with you, and then after that they start to get money from you. So these are some of the things that I would say, in a way, people who the mental health makes people more vulnerable to such attacks. Yeah, I think back to you, Sana. I think Shanta.
Thank you, Julia, for that. Again, Julia, you're absolutely right that the online world itself, apart from the fact that it has its own merits, and if it didn't have its merits, as you rightly said, we three wouldn't be here, and we've never met in person, but I hope that one day, inshallah, we get to. But yes, it does have its own demerits, and as you rightly pointed out, apart from the cyberbullying and all of the threats that do exist online, a lot of the threats that we're not even aware of, social media itself also plays a massive role in, in bringing about problems. And sometimes it exacerbates the problems that you already have. So my question now, Shanta, is that how do we promote and protect, the human rights of people with mental health disabilities? We can probably focus more on in terms of the community before we move on to, yeah, please go ahead.
So for me, it all begins at home, and it begins with, how do we treat our children? Do we have gender roles where boys are not supposed to cry, and if they cry, they are sissies or little girls, right? What do we do when our children melt down? And I'm not talking about a child who has no discipline, right? Either way, parents are responsible. So for me, when your child comes from school, or your child doesn't want to go to school, engage with the child and find out why. There are bigger reasons. When a child is throwing tantrums, don't respond with a tantrum, because then we've got two people having a tantrum that resolves nothing. It starts at home, starts with our children. And then it goes on to the caregivers that we hand them over to and to their teachers. My concern is, who sees to our caregivers' mental health? Who sees to our teachers' mental health? Our nurses and our doctors. Our lawyers that we go to for legal advice when we want to go through a divorce. Who sees to them? Our accountants that are looking at bills every day and have their own mental health issues. So we are really in a vicious cycle. We're trapped in a vicious cycle. And post-COVID, if you look at it, these caregivers, because that's what they are, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a teacher, an accountant, or whatever you do, even the gate person who welcomes your child home when the transport drops him off, they're also part of caregivers. Who sees to them and who ensures that our children are engaging with people who are not going through mental health issues themselves? Suicide rate has hit through the roof with doctors during COVID and post-COVID, right? During COVID, they saw reason to work those hours. Post-COVID, they're still working. When they're on call, they work from 7 a.m., and this is South Africa, 7 a.m. till 4 p.m. the next day. What do you think that person's mental state is like? Communities, right? Our religious organizations have a role to play. They've got to stop saying that it is an abomination. It is this, that, and the other in the scriptures. Because I don't think any scripture mentions look down on your brother or your sister who is sick. No scripture teaches that, right? It is the interpretation by our spiritual leaders. Then also we have the charlatans, don't you forget that come and do this mindfulness. Julia, I love the smile every time when I'm saying things. I think they're really hitting home with you two ladies. Where they say, come and do this practice. They're not trained to do it, but they're making money out of the vulnerable. So what must society do? Again, I go back to accreditation and licensing and being registered. I don't care what you're going to, even if you're going to a swimming instructor, make sure he's a qualified instructor. Whoever you're trusting any part of your life to, make sure that that person is adequate enough. So society has a role to play, non-governmental organizations, but the problem there is funding. Funding internationally is a big issue now. Post-COVID, the world is suffering. Right? So in a nutshell, it starts at home. If you are bringing up a child in a disruptive home or in a home where there's no congruence between the parents, you are responsible for creating the problems in that child. If you are allowing your teachers to suffer burnout and look after other people, principals, it's time to wake up. That's part of my thesis, attitude of management, right? And attitude of education department. Either way, we cannot, from the hierarchy, look down and think everything is fine, because it filters right down to society as such. So where do we start? We start at the bottom, we look for signs, but where do we implement? From the top down. So I think in a nutshell, I hope I've given you the answer there.
You have, Shanta. You've given so many things to think about. And as I said, we have honest people like you who provide these excellent recommendations. But then again, the problem is the implementation of that. Now we are well aware of that. We're well aware of, children and their mental health, and the fact that it starts from the home. But then, when we're talking about individual families, again, it boils down to this idea of stigma. And to what extent is mental health openly discussed, or should be openly discussed? And the sort of, when you talk about the top down procedure, how does that actually happen in practically? So those are some of the things that we do need to think about in more detail. And Julia, would you like to actually add anything to what Shanta said? And would you also like to say, how do you think that we should foster a culture of inclusivity? And if we ourselves personally know of people who are suffering from diagnosed mental health problems, what can we do as individuals?
Okay, so on the part about getting qualified, certified practitioners to treat the mental health patient, I fully agree with that, because there are just way too many people out there, selling their services about mindfulness and all. The problem that we face is that it's very expensive. So one is we need to have more affordable facilities. And the other challenge that I've seen some of, possibly is in the mental health hospitals, is that the attitude of the doctors as well. And, there are various, it's a spectrum, right? Not every single person who is a mental health, needs mental care or health care is somebody that you treat a certain way. It's like, maybe they are overworked doctors that they tend to, just because you have a hammer, you hit everybody like a nail. So that's the kind of situation that I have seen as well. And the other thing is that what I would say, good that we are on social media at the moment, is that if you see a friend who comes up to you and say that he or she is feeling a certain difficulties, or maybe in depression, I say the first thing to do is to recommend the person to seek professional help, rather than to try and help the person and give all sorts of advice that may actually turn out to be more harmful. I have seen how people, there is a difference between being depressed and having depression. And there's some very well-meaning people, friends will say to you, just be happy, positive thinking. This is damaging, right? So I think, one of the recommendation is that we have to build awareness, and this platform is perfect for it. I think Shanta has something to say.
No, Shanta, please go ahead. That is so important, what she said. Please just do elaborate.
When we were children, we learned the song, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. And I think people are taking that too seriously, where they think they can just tell everybody, forget everything. Toxic positivity. It grates the one nerve that I have left to tolerate people who are over positive. There is a limit. People are going through a crisis. You are not qualified to deal with it. And even if you are, know your boundaries. Because the worst thing you can do is take a vulnerable person and make them dependent on you. Counseling is about empowering. And qualified people are trained to do that. I think, there's this, I'm the big deal that you came to for help. especially in families. So I'm going to listen to you and I'm going to give you advice. You're not supposed to give advice. You are supposed to send them to the professional who will empower them to find the power within them. Because that's how they landed up with the mental health problem. Someone's taken away their power. You know, someone's actually brought them down to a level where they are misjudging themselves. So yeah, Julia, you hit the nail on the head, literally and figuratively there, when you even said, you know, service providers, it's like you got the hammer in your hand and you hit every nail that comes to you. I thought that was beautiful, and that spurred a whole lot in my mind as well. So yeah, thank you, Sana, for allowing me to come on straight after Julia.
No, absolutely, Shanta. And, while we're on the subject of being qualified and accredited, again, I think now everyone has become a bit of a counselor in their own capacity. On the one hand, of course, it's a very good thing that we are talking so openly about counselors and mental health. But then on the other hand, you're absolutely right, Julia, that the solution, and Shanta, you as well, the solution to every problem is not positive thinking. It is not, to put your problems on one side and to think about the greater problems that other people have, or, the wars that are taking place in the world. Because sometimes, this is how you feel that you're trying to help someone overcome their problem by talking about greater problems that are happening in the world. But what we fail to understand is that this problem, which may mean nothing to us, might mean the world to that person. There might be a whole war within their own minds that's going on. That might result in something dreadful. And I think that you both are absolutely right, that it's not our place to give suggestions, or at least even if we do, we need to sort of push them so that they get some sort of professional help from a proper forum. So valid points over there. So Shanta and Julia, coming back to workplaces, because this is where obviously almost everyone is at work, and this is where the damage sometimes begins from, or at times, most of the time, that's where it begins from. What do you think? What sort of policies? There are diversity and inclusion policies, but they do not explicitly talk about mental health or necessarily the sort of recourse that's available. Most organizations do not have counselors as well. So what more do you think that organizations should do? Shanta, perhaps if you want to touch on that.
I think there's a need for continued professional development, including personal development. Now, I'll just give you a very quick example. Self-esteem. There's a difference between self-esteem and confidence. You take a sales team, for example, hypothetically, and I'm just thinking of my days in the corporate. You take a sales team. When they're not doing very well, they have low self-esteem, right? Because they work basically on a basic and commission. But they put on the confidence to go out there and be with the clients. Understand, those are two extremes. That person needs more than professional development. That person, especially sales teams and teams that are under pressure in organizations, they need firsthand mental health care. Not to be given trips to go somewhere or free passes to the bar. That does not solve it. I don't know if either of you have engaged with teams, especially those, and I've watched this, who are not doing too well in a month. When it's time to go to the pub or wherever in the evening, they are the ones who are the loudest, the most sociable, and the ones that are really drowning their sorrows in more ways than one. Sadly, some corporates don't understand that's what's happening. And that becomes the corporate culture, the culture of that organization. And it just carries on that way until that person faces their warnings. And it's too late, because they assume that that is the culture of the organization and that's how it carries on. So for me, professional development. And if you're looking at professional development for teachers or educators, it should be done by people who have a knowledge of that profession. If it's for medical, get people who have a knowledge of that profession. There are many out there, especially in our country. I don't know how it is in the other countries, where teachers, doctors, lawyers, etc., are also training to be facilitators for professional and personal growth. So I think that's going to be the great answer.
Thank you for that, Shanta. That was really helpful. Julia, if we move on to you and we, focus on, some of the concluding comments now. The biggest problem with somebody who's suffering from mental health is this whole idea of shame. I can't express myself to anybody. I can't tell anybody what I'm going through, whether I have a diagnosed problem or I don't, because of the idea of shame, guilt, or whatever. How do you think that we as individuals, what more can we do to bring about change, or what can society do? And Shanta, in fact, I'd like you to also, touch on this. What should society do in order to get rid of this whole problem of shame? Julia, please go ahead.
I think this is a very, very interesting or good question. I'd like to draw your attention to, the Tinder swindler, the girl that is the star in the Tinder swindler, the victim herself. She has actually faced a lot of victim shaming, and people actually blame her for being so stupid, for falling for the guy and all that, right? And I think this is something that we individually should be looking at, is to avoid victim blaming. The poor girl has really suffered a lot, not just financially, but emotionally. And of course, she's one brave girl who has actually come out to say her piece, because this is exactly what she wants to advocate, is to support victims who have been in this situation, and to let the world know that it is okay, to reassure people that it's fine, that please come out, and there shouldn't be any shame, and there should be people who would be helping. It's more like advocating for the victims. This kind of initiatives, I'm seeing a lot more happening. In fact, she came out with this Tinder swindler Netflix documentary, is also with the aim to educate people about what it's like to be in the victim's shoes, and to have this peer support group. And I personally am quite involved in cyber safety, cyber security training, because this is how we are going to build awareness. It's not just so vulnerability can be seen from different angles. It could be somebody, at a romance scam, or an old person, or even the youngsters. So there are a lot, and anyone can be a victim. And so it's not because the person happens to be stupid. It's not the case. Although, those people who have never been in those situations may actually think that something is wrong with the victim, and we need to take that stigma away from the victim.
Okay, so you brought up something, Julia. I also agree with it. And the one thing I say to anyone in an online friendship, the day the person gives you a story and says, I'm destitute, I'm dying, I'm in prison, I need money, that is your first red flag. But as much as we can say it, that victim has already been, what we can say, groomed by the person, and has fallen hook, line, and sinker, and getting them out is very difficult. And if we are not showing empathy, then I think we should keep our comments, our adverse comments, to ourselves. We are not here to judge anyone. And not everyone has an analytical business mind. You know, I would say business people who count their pounds, shillings, and pence would look into that and say, no, 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 this is nonsense. But somebody who is vulnerable, you can't, it's just wrong, right? So that's one thing you brought up with the cyber issues. Women who are in marriages, men who are in marriages as well, let's not be gender biased, because they have nowhere else to go. They suffer. And then society looks down on them the day they go out and try and get help. That's something we've got to also look at, right? It's both men and women. People stuck in jobs, right? And immediately they say, I'm feeling depressed, or immediately they come in with a sick note from a mental health practitioner. They are labeled. Children at school who are on leave and come back with a sick note from a mental health practitioner, labeled. Teachers, I've actually seen a mathematics teacher, and if I tell you how long ago this was, it was in my first year of teaching, right back in the 70s. He suffered such great depression. But what do they look at? He's a superb mathematics teacher. The day his services had to be terminated, and he was on temporary staff, it was done in such a brutal way. We heard he collapsed in his class. And I don't want to take that further, because that was one of the most horrendous experiences, absolutely horrendous experience. Nobody saw that he was untidy because he was depressed. Brilliant teacher. Nobody understood that he went out during the lessons to smoke because he was depressed. Nobody. And this was years ago. They were not interested. So stigma. People are suffering because society stigmatizes them. And, you know, I don't want to forget that in Africa, especially South Africa, we now have a special textbook which our 3rd and 4th year psychology students use, and it's African mental health. It is something we need to understand. Where, for example, someone comes and says they have a spiritual calling. It's their culture, respect it. We stigmatize the person. So there's so much we have to be careful of, so much. And I know it is across other cultures as well. So stigma, we've got to stop it. And it's only if we advocate harshly that we can stop it. And I mean very harshly.
Thank you for that very inspirational speech, Shanta, and of course the inspirational, speech from Julia as well. I think that the way, and I'm just going to use this as a parallel, because in, especially in Western countries, I'm not sure about the other countries, things like when you talk about the LGBT community, the rights and, those sort of things for them have become entrenched in the form of legal structures. You have laws regarding that. And that is how that has become a norm in Western societies, something that was previously looked upon, it was frowned upon. It was in fact criminalized as well in Britain, and probably in America as well, but most definitely in Britain. And I think that even as far as mental health is concerned, even though we have some very genuine people who talk about it, we may have some policies, we may have some lousy laws. I think what our systems lack at the moment is a proper legal structure that deals with mental health, that deals with all aspects of society that should take mental health seriously. I mean, I'll give you an example. In Pakistan, we have the Mental Health Ordinance of 2013, but it focuses more on the admission the procedures of how a person is admitted to a hospital and what happens in case a person, if they have a property and somebody dies, what do you do? And if you don't have the mental capacity. But what these laws fail to do is to sort of address these issues of stigma and shame, and how workplaces or the community or families, as you rightly said, Shanta, how all different aspects of society should tackle mental health. And I think that if we were to have stronger legal frameworks, this would become a norm. And when something becomes a norm, it is accepted. And I think that that is one of the main things that is lacking, despite all of these wonderful UN 2030 agenda goals and all of these beautiful declarations of human rights and things that we aspire to. Again, I think that a lot more needs to be done, legally speaking, I think.
Yeah.
So that brings me, Shanta, actually, it brings me to something that I personally feel is very important to also discuss, and without, and sorry, these are just, this is just my last point, and then we can probably log off and you guys can enjoy your evenings. Julia, I know that it's actually quite late in Singapore right now, so my apologies for keeping you up, but you can enjoy your Netflixing or whatever after this. So
No,
recently,
I'm happy to be here.
And I'm so happy to have you here. So recently, we had this World Suicide Prevention Day. And the thing about suicide is that in Pakistan as well, previously suicide was criminalized for religious reasons and other reasons as well. But there was a law that was passed this year which decriminalized suicide. The reason being that if you do commit suicide, there is often always an underlying mental health problem as a result of which you've resorted to something as dire as that. Now, my question is, Shanta, that yes, at times there is a diagnosed mental health problem, but at times society, your family, and all aspects of what we've been talking about fail you, which is why a person feels, and again, without referring to referring to something that I have experienced firsthand recently. How do you address this issue of a suicide where the cause was not a mental health problem per se, but where society has failed you to the extent where you feel that if you live on, you'll have to depend on somebody, you may not have enough money, nobody will give a damn about you, the government won't care about you, the healthcare system won't care about you, and there's nobody that you can go to for help. And if somebody's in that position, it's just awful. Shanta, please go ahead.
I've spoken to people who have been unsuccessful in their attempt at suicide. And they are some of the most courageous people. Society breaks them. Their environment fails them. And it takes a great deal of courage to say, I want to take my last breath. Right? That is, it's not something that they do because they're crazy. I mean, there are people that have, mental disorders, diagnosed mental disorders who have taken their lives, and I acknowledge that with respect. But I'm talking about intelligent, level-headed people who have led normal lives till something has happened and they take their lives. It is very embarrassing for them to continue living. They lose their emotional support. They lose a lot, whether it's from work, whether it's from any of the systems, be it the legal, the medical, or whatever. They have no purpose in living. And sadly, when somebody with that caliber takes his or her life, that is their act of courage to end their suffering. And they don't do it. When you look at a setup, a person who dies by suicide wants, in many cases as well, to punish those by leaving a message for them. You hurt me. You failed me. Now you live with it, because I can't go on with the way you hurt me and you failed me. So yeah, suicide when you're a mentally stable person, it's one of the saddest things. It is the most calculated act to perform on yourself. It really is. I hope that gives you an answer to that, Sana.
It does, Shanta. It does. It, as painful as it is. You've summed it up. And I would just like to say at this juncture that, we've been talking about not giving people advice and things, but because the purpose of Mental Health Day and all of this is basically to be there for each other, to discuss the problems that somebody else is bottling up. My advice to viewers would be that, Shanta, you and Julia are absolutely right. If you're not qualified, don't offer any professional advice. Do refer the person to somebody who is professionally able to help them, but play your role. Please do not be, and sometimes I feel this as well with my own life, that I'm so entangled in my own issues or with my own, priorities, that sometimes I may unintentionally neglect some people who might, be having some genuine problems, and all they need is a ear. All they need is somebody, who can listen to them and probably guide them. And I think that we all should do that. I mean, we all have jobs. I understand we all have families. We all have responsibilities. But I think it's so important for all of us to sometimes step away from the celebrity status that we tend to enjoy in our lives, step away from the work, step away from the social activities that we're doing, and take out time for this person who, is suffering. And there are always some people in your circle who are suffering, and you do know that as well. So just try and add some value in their life. And this is what I would, I would leave viewers with that. And Shanta and Julia, please do share your concluding comments.
For me, the greatest thing is to empower someone to see how empowered they are. Give that person the courage to take back his power, and do it with love, but at the same time, don't get too involved, even as counselors. And I'm registered with Council for Counselors South Africa, not with health professionals. So don't get so invested in it that it affects your mental health. Do everything to make sure that person does not have that courage to take his or her life. That is important to me.
Thank you, Shanta. And Julia, some final words from you.
Yeah, one thing that called out to me was what Shanta mentioned, the professionals, how they are trained to empower the people to take back their own to take back their own lives and to take control of their lives. And I think that is important. And you rightly said, we need to also be aware of the people around us, and that we have is to give some time. And sometimes what they need is just someone to speak to. And if there's no one who is going to speak to them, including their loved ones who failed them, I think this is where people get driven to the end.
Thank you so much, Julia and Shanta. It was such a pleasure to have you both here. I'm always just so delighted to see you both. And, the conversations that we have, they're just enchanting. So thank you guys a million times for being here. And I hope that our viewers would find this an interesting and eye-opening webinar. And again, if you have any questions, please do leave them in the comments box. If you'd like to reach out to Shanta or to Julia, they are available on LinkedIn. So you can always add them and, take any advice, whatever it is. So with that, I thank you for listening to us. And thank you so much, Julia and Shanta, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.